The train shrieked, a mournful sound that seemed to slice through the brittle blue sky and pour dust into the air. Ilara clutched the handle of her small trunk, her knuckles white. Inside it, folded with a reverence usually reserved for scripture, was the letter. 4 pages of careful script from a man named Silas Croft, promising a home, a life, a future in a town called Redemption Gulch. A place where a woman's past could be washed clean by the vast, unforgiving sun. A place where, she had prayed, the whisper of Apache would be lost on the wind. She stepped down onto the splintered platform, the hem of her grey traveling dress immediately gathering a fringe of ochre dust. The town was less a gulch and more a gash in the earth, a raw wound of raw lumber and staring, glass-eyed windows under a relentless sky. Hope, a fragile bird she had nursed in her heart for the 1,000-mile journey, fluttered weakly against her ribs. This was it. The end of the orphanage, the end of being neither one thing nor the other, the beginning of being Mistress Croft. Silas Croft had described himself as a man of standing, a merchant. She found him in the town's largest building, a general store that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and the faint, cloying sweetness of licorice sticks in a glass jar. He stood behind the counter, a thick man with a waistcoat straining at the buttons and a face that looked scrubbed raw with piety. When she announced herself, her voice a reedy thing she hardly recognized, his smile was a brief, welcoming flicker. "Miss Ilara Vance?" He wiped his hands on his apron. "You've made good time." He came around the counter, and the welcoming flicker in his eyes died, snuffed out like a cheap candle. His gaze did not meet hers. It traveled, a slow, methodical inventory of her features. It traced the high, proud line of her cheekbones, lingered on the warm olive tint of her skin, and narrowed on the straight, blue-black fall of her hair, which no amount of severe pinning could disguise. The air in the store grew thick and still. The half-dozen customers, miners and wives in faded calico, stopped their transactions, their gazes turning to watch the silent, unfolding drama. "The agent," Silas Croft said, his voice no longer welcoming but a low, accusatory rumble, "assured me of a respectable woman, a decent, white woman." Each word was a stone dropped into the well of her hope. Ilara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame so profound it was sickening. "My father was a white man, Mr. Croft. I was raised in a Christian institution." He held up a hand, a gesture of absolute, contemptuous dismissal. "I will not have half-breed children. I will not have my name sullied by this." He gestured vaguely at her, as if she were a piece of spoiled goods he was refusing to accept. "The arrangement is void. You should not have come." It was the finality that broke her, not the insult, for she had heard versions of it her entire life, but the cold, unalterable finality. He turned his back on her, a mountain of self-righteous tweed, and began rearranging tins on a shelf as if she had already vanished. The onlookers stared, their expressions ranging from pity to a kind of smug satisfaction. This was a story they would tell tonight over dinner. The mail-order bride who wasn't what she claimed. Someone jostled her, eager to get to the counter. The spell was broken. Humiliation, hot and sharp, propelled her backward, out of the store and into the blinding, indifferent sunlight. Her trunk sat on the dusty boardwalk where she had left it. It looked smaller now, impossibly fragile. The entire sum of her life, and it wasn't enough. She was stranded, a public spectacle, an unwanted thing in a town called Redemption that offered none. From the shadows of the livery stable across the street, a man watched. He had seen the train arrive, had seen the woman with the straight back and the hopeful eyes walk into Croft's emporium. He saw her emerge minutes later, her face a mask of stunned disbelief, the proud line of her shoulders slumped. Caleb Thorne had seen a lot of cruelty in his years as a ranger, but the quiet, sanctimonious kind was often the worst. It left no visible bruises, only shattered spirits. He noted the way Silas Croft's customers scurried out, refusing to meet the woman's eyes. He noted the way she stood perfectly still, as if moving might cause her to crumble into dust. He saw it all, and the jagged scar that pulled at the corner of his mouth tightened. For hours, Ilara existed in a state of suspended animation. She sat on her trunk as the sun arced across the sky, beating down on her head. She watched the life of the town flow around her, a river that parted to avoid the rock of her despair. She tried the boarding house, a grim establishment run by a woman with a mouth like a snapped purse, who took one look at her and declared there were no rooms. She tried the hotel, where the clerk laughed. The story had already made its rounds. She was marked. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange into the sky, a cold wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a bitter night. It whipped her skirts around her ankles and chilled her to the bone. Despair was a physical thing now, a hollow ache in her chest. She had nowhere to go, no one. The fragile hope she had carried for so long had finally died, and she was alone with the corpse. It was then that he approached. He moved without a sound, a tall, lean shape detaching itself from the deepening twilight. She flinched, her hand flying to her throat. His face was a roadmap of old violence, a web of silvery scars that crisscrossed one cheek and disappeared into his hairline. But his eyes, when they met hers, were startlingly clear and steady. They held no judgment, no pity, only a quiet, assessing gravity. "You can't stay here," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a voice accustomed to disuse. He gestured with his head towards a sturdy wagon parked near the livery. A horse stood harnessed and patient, its breath fogging in the cooling air. Ilara stared at him, caught between terror and a sliver of something else. He was an outcast. She could see it in the way he held himself apart, in the way no one greeted him. An outcast recognizes another. "I have no money," she whispered, the words tasting of ash. He gave a short, dismissive shake of his head. "Didn't ask for any." He looked up at the sky, where the first drops of rain were beginning to fall. Cold and fat. "Storm's coming. The gulch ain't a kind place to be caught out in." Every instinct, honed by a life of caution and fear, screamed at her to refuse. To trust a scarred stranger was madness. But then she looked at his hands. They were calloused and capable, resting easily at his sides. They were not the soft, accusatory hands of Silas Croft. And in the depths of his gaze, she saw a reflection of her own loneliness. Desperation made its choice. With a slow, aching movement, she stood up. He loaded her trunk into the back of the wagon with an easy, powerful motion, then helped her up onto the seat. His touch was brief and impersonal, but his grip was firm, steadying. He didn't speak again as he clicked the reins and guided the horse away from the mocking lights of the town, heading out into the vast, gathering darkness. The rain began in earnest, washing the dust from her face, mingling with the silent tears she finally allowed to fall. The journey was a blur of rumbling wheels and the rhythmic drumming of rain on the wagon's canvas cover. They traveled for what felt like an hour, moving steadily away from the town and into the low, rolling hills. The cabin, when they reached it, was little more than a dark silhouette against a darker sky. It was small, isolated, a fortress against the world. Caleb led the horse into a lean-to, then carried her trunk to the door, setting it down with a quiet thud. Inside, he lit a lantern. The light bloomed, pushing back the shadows to reveal a single, Spartan room. It was meticulously clean. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a narrow cot was pushed against another. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. There were no decorations, no softness, nothing to suggest a life beyond mere survival. It was the home of a man who expected nothing from the world and offered no part of himself to it. "The loft is up there," he said, gesturing to a ladder leading to a small sleeping platform above. You can have it. There are blankets in the chest. He moved to the hearth and began to build a fire with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. Ilara stood frozen in the middle of the room, dripping onto the floorboards, clutching her shawl around her. The silence was immense, broken only by the crackle of kindling catching flame and the howling of the wind outside. This was her sanctuary, a cage offered by a stranger. She was safe from the storm, but a new, more uncertain tempest was raging inside her. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Caleb Thorne was a ghost in his own home. He would rise before dawn and be gone, melting into the wilderness that surrounded them. He would return at dusk, sometimes with a brace of rabbits or a string of fish, which he would clean and prepare without a word. He left portions for her on the table before retreating to his cot, turning his back to the room. He never intruded, never asked questions, never even looked at her for more than a passing moment. He had offered her shelter, and that was all. Ilara, in turn, moved through the cabin with a quiet determination not to be a burden. She felt like a stray dog taken in from the rain, wary and desperate to earn her keep. She washed the few dishes, mended a tear in one of his shirts with thread from her own small sewing kit, and swept the floorboards until they shone. She discovered his small stock of flour, beans, and dried herbs and began to cook, turning the game he brought into savory, filling stews. The first time she left a bowl on the table for him, he stopped and looked at it for a long moment before sitting down to eat. He ate every last bite, but said nothing. His silence was not unkind. It was a wall, and she did not know how to breach it. She learned him in pieces, through observation. The way he favored his left leg slightly when he was tired. The way his hands, though scarred, were gentle when he checked his traps. The way he would sometimes stand at the window for long stretches, staring out at the unforgiving landscape, his face a mask of impenetrable sorrow. She saw the deep loss he carried, a burden that mirrored her own. They were two solitary islands, separated by a sea of unspoken grief. The breach in the wall came, as it so often does, with a storm. Not a simple rain, but a furious, late autumn squall that threw itself at the cabin with the force of a battering ram. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rain turned to sleet that rattled against the single window pane. Caleb had been forced to stay in, and the small space felt charged with their combined presence. He sat at the table, methodically sharpening a knife, while Ilara sat by the fire, pretending to read the one book she owned. A particularly violent gust of wind hit the cabin, and the structure groaned in protest. Ilara flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. Caleb's hands stilled on the whetstone. "It'll hold," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I built it to." She looked up, meeting his eyes across the flickering firelight. For the first time, the wall between them seemed to thin. "My mother." She was terrified of storms, Ilara found herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She used to say it was the spirits of the ancestors, angry with the world. He didn't dismiss her words. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on her face. "What was her name?" "Anawa," Ilara whispered. "It means rain in her people's tongue. My father—" He called her Anna. She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "He left after she died. Said I looked too much like her. He put me in the St. Jude's home for foundlings. They gave me the name Ilara Vance. They tried to wash the Apache out of me." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "They failed." She told him everything then, the lonely years in the orphanage, the constant feeling of being an imposter, the desperate hope pinned to Silas Croft's letter. She spoke of the humiliation on the dusty street of Redemption Gulch, the feeling of being utterly erased. When she finished, the only sound was the fire and the storm. Caleb set his knife and stone aside. The firelight carved deep shadows into the scars on his face, making them seem like ancient runes. "Scars," he said, his voice a low rasp. "People see them, and they think they know your story. He touched the most prominent one on his cheek. Got this one at Shiloh. Fought for a cause I stopped believing in halfway through. Watched boys die for nothing. He paused, his gaze turning inward. Came home. Found my wife. My boy. Taken by fever. The whole town was a graveyard. There was nothing left. Nothing but the quiet. He looked around the Spartan cabin. So I came out here. Found a different kind of quiet. Some folks need people to feel whole. Some of us, we just need a place to be broken in peace. In that moment, Ilara understood him. He was not just a scarred recluse. He was a man hollowed out by grief. His silence wasn't a rejection of her, but a shield for himself. And in offering her shelter, he had shared the only thing he had left: his solitude. A fragile bridge of shared sorrow now spanned the sea between them. A quiet routine began to take root in the small cabin, a fragile domesticity that bloomed in the space Caleb's grief had left fallow. Ilara tended the hearth, turning the cabin from a mere shelter into a home. She learned the rhythms of his days, anticipating his return with a warm meal, his mending pile always seen to. She even started a small garden near the door, coaxing hardy greens from the stubborn soil. In return, Caleb began to leave small offerings on the table: a handful of late-blooming wild berries, a curiously shaped stone, a single eagle feather he'd found on a high ridge. They were his words, his silent acknowledgments of her presence. The tension in Ilara's shoulders began to ease. She found herself humming sometimes, a forgotten tune from a life before the orphanage. But the world beyond their isolated sanctuary had not forgotten them. Gossip, like a noxious weed, had taken root in Redemption Gulch and grown strong. Silas Croft, his pride stung by both Ilara's perceived deceit and her survival, fanned the flames. The story twisted and grew ugly. It was no longer about a rejected bride. It was about the scarred, half-mad ranger who was keeping a savage woman in his cabin. A stain on the community. A moral outrage. The intrusion came on a crisp, sunlit morning. Ilara was outside, hanging laundry on a line Caleb had strung between two pines, when she saw the riders. There were three of them: Silas Croft, his face puffed with indignation, the town's severe-looking preacher, Mr. Abernathy, and a burly man who worked as Croft's lackey. They rode as if on a crusade, their expressions grim and purposeful. Fear, cold and familiar, lanced through Ilara. She froze, her hands still clutching a damp shirt. Caleb emerged from the cabin, moving with a deceptive calmness. He held his rifle, not aimed, but held with an ease that was more menacing than any overt threat. He stopped on the small porch, positioning himself slightly in front of the door, a silent guardian. "Thorn," Croft called out, reining in his horse a safe distance away. "We've come on behalf of the decent folk of this town. It's an abomination what you're doing, harboring this woman." The preacher nodded gravely. "It is a sinful arrangement, my son. You are living in transgression. For the good of your soul and the moral fabric of this community, you must send her away." Caleb's expression did not change. His scarred face was a stone mask. He looked past the men, his gaze settling on Ilara. For a long moment, their eyes met. She saw a question there, but also a flicker of something fierce and protective. She lifted her chin, her fear receding behind a wave of indignation. She would not be chased away again. She straightened her back, standing her ground. A flicker of understanding passed through Caleb's eyes. He turned his attention back to the riders. His voice, when he spoke, was flat and devoid of emotion, yet it carried across the clearing with absolute authority. "There is no sinful arrangement here, preacher," he stated. "And she is not this woman." He took a half-step to the side, so he was standing next to the doorframe rather than blocking it, a subtle invitation, an inclusion. "You are speaking of my wife." The word hung in the air, stunning the riders into silence. Ilara's heart gave a violent lurch. Wife. The word she had longed to be, now used as a shield, a lie forged in an instant to protect her. Croft's face turned a blotchy red. Wife. That's a lie. There's been no marriage, no posting of banns. My affairs are my own, Caleb said, his voice dropping lower, taking on a dangerous edge. And my wife's home is her own. You are trespassing. He raised the rifle then. Just an inch, a small movement that spoke volumes. I suggest you remember your manners, address her as Mistress Thorne, and then I suggest you leave. The preacher stammered, his moral certainty faltering in the face of Caleb's cold resolve. Croft looked from Caleb's unyielding face to Ilara's defiant one. He had come expecting to find a frightened girl and a broken man. He had found a fortress. With a sputtered curse, he wheeled his horse around, the other two scrambling to follow. They galloped away, their righteous crusade ending in a cloud of dust and impotent fury. Ilara and Caleb stood in the sudden silence, the sound of the retreating hoofbeats fading into the whisper of the pines. The air between them crackled with the weight of the word he had spoken. Wife. He had claimed her. In front of the very man who had rejected her, he had given her a name, a place, a shield of his own making. He turned slowly to face her, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Ilara did not see the scars. She saw only the man who had built a wall around her with a single, powerful lie. The lie settled over the cabin, a strange, protective blanket. It changed nothing and everything. Their days continued in their quiet rhythm, but a new current ran beneath the surface. When Caleb spoke to her, which was still rare, he sometimes stumbled over her name, as if testing out the sound of Mistress Thorne in his own mind. For Ilara, the title was a bittersweet echo of a dream she had abandoned. It was a fiction, but it was a fiction that kept the world at bay. Silas Croft, however, was not a man to be thwarted. Humiliated and enraged, he saw their defiance not just as a personal slight, but as a threat to the rigid order of his world. He could not storm the cabin again, not against Caleb's rifle, but he had other weapons. He began to poison the well of public opinion with more venomous whispers, suggesting Caleb had abducted Ilara, that she was being held against her will. He hinted that a man so scarred on the outside must surely be twisted on the inside. The true crisis came with the first deep snow of winter. It fell thick and fast, burying the world in a pristine, deadly silence. One night, as the wind howled and shook the cabin, a bright, unnatural orange light flickered against the window. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, grabbing his rifle. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice tight. Ilara rushed to the window just in time to see it. A section of the lean-to where they stored firewood was ablaze, the flames licking hungrily at the dry timber, creeping toward the main wall of the cabin. In the swirling snow, she saw a figure on horseback, a fleeting shadow melting back into the storm. Croft. Caleb burst out the door, grabbing buckets. Ilara didn't hesitate. She was no longer the frightened woman who had arrived in Redemption Gulch. This was her home they were attacking. She grabbed the heaviest blankets she could find, soaked them in their water barrel, and followed him into the biting cold. They fought the fire together, a desperate, silent team against the raging elements. The heat was scorching, the smoke a choking blanket. Caleb worked with a ferocious energy, throwing bucket after bucket of snow and water onto the flames. Ilara beat at the spreading edges with the heavy, sodden blankets, her arms aching, her lungs burning. A burning log shifted and fell, and Caleb shoved her out of the way, taking a glancing blow from the fiery wood across his forearm. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. Finally, gasping and exhausted, they beat the fire into submission. It died with a final, hissing gasp, leaving behind a blackened, steaming ruin and the acrid smell of burnt pine. They stood in the snow, their chests heaving, the silence of the winter night descending once more. Caleb leaned against the cabin wall, cradling his arm. "Come inside," Ilara said, her voice firm. She took his good arm and led him back into the smoky warmth of the cabin. There, in the lantern light, she saw the burn. It was a nasty, angry red wound on his forearm. Without a word, she went to her trunk. From the very bottom, she pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside were dried herbs and poultices, the knowledge passed down from her mother, Anawa. Knowledge from the people they had tried to wash out of her. She cleaned the wound gently, her touch sure and steady. He watched her, his face grim with pain, but he did not pull away. She ground the herbs, mixed them with a little water to make a paste, and spread it carefully over the burn. His muscles tensed under her fingers, but he remained silent. She wrapped his arm with clean strips of linen torn from one of her petticoats. When she was done, they sat at the table, the unspoken terror of the attack hanging between them. The fire in the hearth crackled, a comforting counterpoint to the destructive blaze outside. "He tried to kill us," Ilara whispered. "Or burn us out." Caleb looked at his bandaged arm, then at her. His eyes were dark with a cold, controlled fury she had never seen before. "He won't get another chance," he said. The words were a vow. In that moment, their shared fiction of a marriage fell away, burned to ash like the woodpile. They were no longer a man and a woman bound by a convenient lie. They were partners. They had faced death together, defended their home together. He had shielded her with his body, and she had tended his wounds with the quiet wisdom of her ancestors. The bond between them, forged in shared loss and silent understanding, had been tempered by fire into something hard and real and unbreakable. The failed arson marked a turning point. The blackened timbers of the lean-to stood as a stark monument to Silas Croft's malice. Caleb worked to rebuild it, his movements filled with a grim determination. But the attack had also emboldened Croft. Having failed to drive them out with fire, he turned to the law, riding to the next county to fetch the sheriff with a fabricated tale of abduction and depravity. Sheriff Miller arrived 2 days later, a weary, pragmatic man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much foolishness. He did not come with a posse, only a single deputy. He found Caleb splitting wood, his bandaged arm a clear testament to the recent violence, and Ilara scrubbing the porch, her expression one of guarded resolve. "Thorne," the sheriff said, dismounting, "got a complaint against you from a Silas Croft, says you're holding this woman here against her will." Before Caleb could speak, Ilara stepped forward. The timid woman who had crumbled under Croft's scorn was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had fought fire and found her footing on the hard soil of this land. "Sheriff Miller," she said, her voice clear and steady, "my name is Ilara Thorne. This is my husband, and this is my home. The only person who has threatened me or held me against my will is Silas Croft, the man who sent you here. He is the one who tried to burn our home down around us 2 nights ago." She gestured to Caleb's arm. "My husband was injured putting out the fire that Mr. Croft set." The sheriff's gaze shifted from Ilara's unwavering face to Caleb's bandaged arm and the charred lean-to. He looked back at Ilara, at the quiet dignity that radiated from her, and a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He had heard Croft's wild, hateful story. What he saw here did not match. Just then, a new set of riders appeared on the trail leading to the cabin. It was Silas Croft, and this time he had not come with the law or the preacher. He had gathered a mob. A half-dozen men, their courage fortified by whiskey from the saloon, followed him, their faces set in grim, ugly lines. They were armed with farm tools and a palpable sense of mob justice. "There they are, Sheriff!" Croft shouted, pointing a triumphant finger. "The heathen and the recluse who harbors her, we've come to see that justice is done, even if the law is too slow." Sheriff Miller sighed, placing a hand on the butt of his pistol. "Now, Silas, you stand down. This is official business." But Croft and his men were beyond reason. They fanned out, forming a menacing semicircle in front of the cabin. Caleb moved to stand beside Ilara, his stance relaxed but ready, his rifle now in his hands. He was a silent, immovable mountain. It was Ilara who spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She addressed the men behind Croft, the farmers and miners she recognized from the town. "You came all this way because this man told you I was a blight on your community," she began, her voice carrying in the still winter air. "He told you that because my mother was Apache, I am something less than human. He rejected me for it, left me with nothing. This man," she gestured to Caleb, "he offered me shelter when no one else would. He gave me safety. He treated me with respect." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over their faces. "You look at his scars, and this man's words tell you he is a monster. I look at him and I see the man who stood between me and a fire. You look at my skin, and this man's words tell you I am a savage. I ask you to look into my heart. Is it savage to build a home, to tend a garden, to care for the person who has cared for you? Silas Croft speaks of decency and morals, yet he is the one who uses fire and lies in the dead of night. Who is the real savage here?" Her words fell into a profound silence. The men in the mob shifted uncomfortably. They had come for a simple, righteous act of removal. They were not prepared for a sermon on the nature of humanity from their intended victim. They looked at Croft's furious, mottled face, then at Ilara's quiet, powerful dignity, and Caleb's unwavering loyalty beside her. They saw the charred woodpile. They saw the bandaged arm. The whiskey-fueled certainty began to curdle into doubt and shame. Sheriff Miller broke the silence. He turned to Croft, his voice hard as iron. "Silas, I'd say your complaint is without merit. What I see here is a man and his wife defending their home. What I see from you is an attempt to incite a riot, and from the looks of it, a likely charge of arson. Now you and your boys get. Before I decide to arrest the lot of you." One by one, the men in the mob lowered their pitchforks and axes. They avoided Croft's eyes, their faces sullen. They turned and shuffled away, their righteous fury dissolved, leaving Silas Croft standing alone, his authority shattered, his hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. He stared at Ilara and Caleb, his face a mask of pure hatred, before finally turning his horse and riding away, a defeated, diminished man. The threat was gone. In the quiet aftermath, Ilara and Caleb stood on the porch of the home they had defended together. The sheriff touched the brim of his hat. "Mistress Thorne, you have a good day." With a nod, he and his deputy mounted up and left. Alone at last, Ilara turned to Caleb. The silence between them was no longer a wall, but a shared space, deep and comfortable. He looked down at her, and the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften. The scar by his mouth, which had always seemed a mark of harshness, now looked like the beginning of a smile. "Ilara Thorne," he said, tasting the name, making it real. "It suits you." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so full and bright, it almost hurt. "Caleb," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." "Nothing to thank me for," he said gruffly, though his eyes told a different story. "A man protects his own." In the weeks and months that followed, a new kind of life took hold. Their marriage, born of a lie and forged in fire, became their truth. They were no longer outcasts, hiding from the world, but a family rooted in the very land that had once seemed so hostile. News of the confrontation spread, and the town's opinion, once so easily swayed by Croft, now settled in grudging respect. People began to nod to them on the rare occasions they went to town for supplies. The store owner's wife pressed a bag of sweets into Ilara's hand, a silent apology. They were no longer judged by their skin or their scars, but by the content of their unshakable bond. One spring evening, Ilara was kneeling in her garden, pressing seeds into the dark, rich earth. The air was soft, filled with the scent of damp soil and new life. She looked up at the cabin, no longer a Spartan shelter but a home, with curtains she had sewn in the window and a sturdy, rebuilt lean-to. Caleb sat on the porch steps, watching her. The setting sun bathed him in a golden light, and in that moment she saw the entirety of her journey. She had come to this place seeking a life that was promised to her, only to have it snatched away. And in the wreckage of that hope, she had found something far more precious. She had not been given a home. She had built one. She had not been given a family. She had forged one. He met her gaze from across the yard, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching his eyes. It transformed his scarred features, revealing the gentle, resilient man beneath. Ilara smiled back, a feeling of profound peace settling over her. The world was still a harsh place, the wind still blew cold from the mountains. But here, in this small pocket of the wilderness, with this man, she was not half of anything. She was whole. She was home.